The day before you want to make your sourdough hamburger buns, take 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter out of the fridge. It's best to feed your sourdough starter in the morning or around noon so that you can mix together your final dough in the evening before you go to bed. To that leftover sourdough starter, add 50 grams of water and 50 grams of bread flour, mix it together, and put a rubber band on top to see how much it rises. Let it rise for about 4 to 8 hours until it doubles or triples in size. If your starter rises, it'll make your bread rise. When your starter is risen and you're ready to mix your dough, preferably in the evening, get out a big mixing bowl and add 150 grams of water and then 100 grams of whole milk. This milk will add a softness to the dough that you won't get using just water. Then add 25 grams of white sugar, 10 grams of salt, and then 100 grams of that active risen sourdough starter that you fed hours earlier. Once you've weighed the 100 grams of sourdough starter into the bowl, you should have about 25 grams of starter left over. Take that jar of leftover sourdough starter, put it in the fridge, and save it for the next time you want to bake bread. Then stir all of the starter into the liquid ingredients until it's pretty much dissolved, and add 450 grams of plain white bread flour. The brand I like to use is King Arthur brand of bread flour in the blue bag. It's around 13% protein. Almost any brand of bread flour should work great, but those are the specs on the bread flour that I am using. Once you've added the flour to the bowl, stir all of the ingredients together until you've formed a rough, shaggy dough. If the dough seems a little rough and dry at this point, that's totally fine. It's supposed to look that way. There's one ingredient that we haven't added yet to the dough, and that's butter. The butter is going to bring things together and make the dough soft and silky, but for now, the dough should look just like this. Go ahead and cover up the dough at this point and let it rest for 30 minutes. This 30-minute rest period will help the gluten develop a little bit in the dough before we add the butter, and that'll make it easier to add the butter later. You can see that after the half-hour rest, the dough holds together a little bit better than it did before. Now it's time to add the butter to the dough. I have here 54 grams or half a US stick of butter that's been cut up into cubes and let to sit out on the counter and soften for about 30 minutes to an hour. The butter should be soft and pliable, but not too melty and greasy. That's the perfect consistency that you want in the butter. Place all of the butter cubes right on top of the dough and start squeezing them into the dough with your fingers. At first, the butter will feel a little bit difficult to incorporate into the dough. The butter will start absorbing some of those dry bits of flour if you have any, and the dough won't really want to accept the fatty butter into the dough mass. But as you keep kneading with your fingertips just like this for about a minute or 2 minutes, the dough will eventually accept the butter and bring it into the dough, and the dough will become soft, smooth, and silky, which is exactly what you want in a hamburger bun dough. Once you have a smooth, silky dough on your hands without any butter clumps anywhere to be found, cover the dough up with a kitchen towel and let the dough rest for another 30 minutes on the counter. After the half-hour rest, it's time for the first set of stretch and folds. With a slightly moistened hand, just grab an edge of the dough, stretch it up into the air, and fold it over the top of the dough. Then grab the next edge of the dough and do the same thing, going around the bowl, grabbing an edge of dough, stretching it up in the air, and folding it over the top. Do this about 12 to 24 times until the dough really starts to resist the stretching and folding. That's how I know when I'm done stretching and folding during each set, once the dough starts to tighten up and start resisting the stretching. Stretching and folding is an option for building gluten development in a dough without hand kneading. Kneading can take about 8 to 15 minutes depending on the type of dough you're kneading, and especially if you're making an enriched dough like this one with butter and milk, hand kneading can sometimes get a little bit sloppy. So I do like stretching and folding for this recipe. After the first set of stretch and folds, cover up the dough again, let it rest for another 30 minutes, and then perform the second set of stretch and folds. The dough should be a little bit easier to handle this time as the gluten continues to develop. Ideally, you'll notice that the dough feels softer and lighter and silkier after the second set of stretch and folds. That is what you're looking for. Put the dough back in the bowl, cover it up with a kitchen towel, and let it rest for 30 more minutes, and then you're ready for the third and final set of stretch and folds. This one is just like the first two. You don't have to go as many times. If you just want to do 10 to 12 stretch and folds, that's fine. You should notice the dough feeling a lot smoother, and it might even start resisting your stretching a little bit sooner. Once the dough is soft and silky like this, flip it over so the smooth side is on the top and the seam side is on the bottom. Place it back into the mixing bowl, then cover up the bowl with an airtight lid or a layer of plastic wrap. The butter inside the dough should prevent the dough from sticking to the plastic wrap after the overnight rise. Since this is going to rise overnight at room temperature, I really don't want the dough to dry out. That's why I recommend covering it first with a layer of plastic wrap and then a kitchen towel. For the first rise or the bulk fermentation, let your dough sit out overnight at room temperature and rise for about 8 to 10 hours until it looks something like this. It should be filled with air, puffy, and about doubled in size. Now is the perfect time to divide and shape this dough into 8 individual hamburger buns. So transfer the dough onto your clean counter, no flour necessary on the counter by the way, and shape it loosely into a ball like this. Then get out your favorite chef's knife or bench scraper or dough scraper and divide the dough into 8 equal pieces. If you don't care too much about getting your hamburger buns the exact same size, you can just do this by eyeballing it, cut the dough in half, then cut each half into 4 pieces, and you'll have 8 roughly equal sized hamburger bun doughs. But I went the extra step this time and took each of those 8 pieces of dough and made sure they were about 110 grams each. Once the dough is divided and scaled, it's time to shape each individual bun. I do a stretching and folding process like this, taking the edges of dough and stretching them underneath the dough, and then I hold them there with my thumb. Then I flip the dough over so the smooth side is on top and the seam side is underneath. Then I take my hand like a claw and roll it over top of each bun. That will smooth out the edges of the bun and tighten it up into a tight ball. Here's that shaping process one more time. I just grab the dough with my hand, do the claw motion over top, rolling the dough until it becomes a tight ball. You might have noticed I haven't used any flour on the counter up to this point. That's because the flourless counter really helps hold the balls in place and it helps you in the shaping process. But you can add a little bit of flour to the balls of dough if you are dealing with dough that's just too sticky. But overall, you shouldn't need to use too much flour. Now that you've got 8 110-gram hamburger buns, it's time to place them into your baking vessel. I like to use my favorite 9x13 cake pan, then I add just 1 layer of parchment paper to it. I don't necessarily need the parchment because this is a non-stick pan, but I like the fact that this parchment paper will allow me to lift the buns out of the pan later, all at once. So I do use 1 layer of parchment paper. Arrange the hamburger buns neatly into the 9x13 pan. There should be a little bit of a gap in between each one. You want that gap now because as the buns rise and as they bake later, they will bake into each other. So if you want nice pull-apart hamburger buns, a little bit of gap now is fine because that gap will disappear as they bake. Before the buns proof, I like to brush the tops of the buns with 1 tablespoon of melted butter. This is technically an optional step, but I really recommend it. It'll give the buns a nice sheen as they rise. The layer of butter seems to prevent the buns from drying out as well. Now for the final proof, cover up the buns with a layer or 2 of plastic wrap just to make sure they're airtight, and let the buns rise at room temperature on the counter for 3 to 6 hours or until they're almost completely doubled in size. In my warm kitchen, the hamburger buns doubled in just 3 hours. By the way, 30 minutes before the buns are ready to bake while they're still rising, preheat your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. The buns are ready to bake when they look airy and puffy and really light. The lighter your hamburger buns look now, the fluffier and airier they will be after they bake. Immediately before you put the buns in the oven to bake, mix together an egg wash of 1 whole egg and then about a tablespoon of whole milk. Brush this on top of the hamburger buns. This will give the buns a classic golden brown sheen that is common with brioche-style hamburger buns and brioche bread in general. It's technically an optional step, but one I highly recommend. When the buns are brushed and glistening, transfer them directly into the hot 400 degree Fahrenheit oven that has been preheating for at least a half hour. Place the baking tray onto the middle rack of your oven and slide the buns in to bake for 25 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll notice that the buns grow only by about 10%. They didn't have much room left to grow because they proofed for so long. That's going to give you nice, light, and fluffy buns. If you make the mistake of not letting the buns proof for long enough during the final proof, they might actually rise too much in the oven and split, and that is not what you want. The buns will be denser that way. If you let the buns rise to almost their full potential during the final proof, that will give you exactly what you want, light and fluffy hamburger buns that get golden brown during the last 5 minutes of the bake. Optionally, if you want darker hamburger buns, you can just let them keep baking for another 5 or 10 minutes and they'll of course get darker. After the buns come out of the oven, I like to brush them with 1 more tablespoon of melted butter. You might say this is overkill, but why not? It gives the buns a nice shiny look and a delicious flavor that you're not going to get from grocery store hamburger buns. Immediately after brushing the buns with butter, transfer them from the pan onto a wire rack or onto your stovetop like I'm doing here, and let them cool for about 20 to 30 minutes before serving. And then right before serving, I like to do, you know what? You guessed it. 1 more tablespoon of butter brushed on top of the rolls to give them that classic shine. These rolls came out great, nice and golden brown on the top and the bottom. They're not burnt on the bottom, by the way, that's just extra brown from the egg wash. They pull apart nicely. I love making pull apart rolls like this that bake up into each other. They kind of remind me of supermarket hamburger buns, except they look and smell way better. The feel of these hamburger buns is pretty substantial, except they're still really airy and soft. They have a nice bounce back to them too when you squeeze them, showing me that they're not dense, but they have a nice airy interior. Let's cut into one of these and see what it looks like on the inside. The interior is soft and fluffy with a closed crumb, but you can tell it's really light and airy. This is exactly what I'd want from a milky and buttery enriched dough. I think it's exactly what you want holding together your classic hamburger too. Let's see how it holds up to a full hamburger with toppings. First, a quick squeeze test just for fun. Got some good burger sauce in there. Upon first bite, this sourdough hamburger bun definitely holds up to a classic cheeseburger. The best way I can describe the flavor and texture of this hamburger bun is that it's like a supermarket mass-produced hamburger bun, except that it actually tastes like something and feels like something. Supermarket hamburger buns are light and airy and squishy, and this one is airy, but it still has substance. Supermarket hamburger buns don't really taste like anything. This has a buttery, full flavor. It's milky, it's soft, it's lightly sweet. This is exactly what I want in a sourdough hamburger bun, and I'm glad to be sharing the recipe with you today. Give it a try.